what are some of the challenges that are being faced by political parties in these negotiations. Dr. Dirk Kotze is on the line. We're expecting that Professor Sipho Seepe will also join the conversation. Dr. Kotze, good evening to you and thanks for your time. It was predicted that there would be a blended approach to these coalitions, so that parties would not necessarily go into it with die-hard approaches of one agreement being uniform across the various hung municipalities. Are we seeing much of that happen? It seems very much that, there's some tough lines that political parties have taken, and it's across-the-board agreement so far.
Yes, I think the parties follow different approaches, but what is very much in the news is now the approach that's followed by the DA, by the EFF, and to some extent by the ANC, which is more of a sort of a positional approach that they are following. They're taking a position as a point of departure. It's very similar to trade unions when they are involved in salary negotiations. And then they start to negotiate and see if they can find the other parties somewhere in the middle ultimately. In smaller areas, in some of the towns, in places like Laingsburg, for example, and in Cederberg, where they've already reached agreement, there the process was quite different because it's smaller, there are fewer parties involved. It's national parties, but local parties also. So the dynamics were very different. But when we look at the metropolitan councils, then it's very much the big parties, the national parties, that are involved in these negotiations, but some others like Action SA and some other groups like the Patriotic Alliance also now. I think what they are doing is that they are still putting positions up on the table and see to what extent other parties are going to respond to it. I think where they have to be careful is that they don't paint themselves into a corner, and that they make commitments that are so non-negotiable that later on they cannot come back to those positions in order to say that ultimately what dictates is that in a coalition you need the 50% plus one as the minimum size for a government. And in some cases, ultimately, it brings parties that are very far apart right at the end together in order to reach that point. Because ultimately, if that doesn't happen, it means there's a stalemate. And then the different aspects that have been referred to about dissolving the council, by-elections and all sorts of things become then possibilities.
I want to talk about those shortly, but before we get to that, what are the stakes for the ANC in these potential at least coalition agreements? Because out of all the parties, it is the one that is consistently being mentioned by various parties who say they're not interested with working with the ANC, the EFF being the latest today to make that position.
Well, I think one of the reasons for this is that the ANC lost votes. It's seen a bit as a losing party at this stage. So it's seen by many as a party that's weaker than before. It's in a relatively weak position, though they have 45, 46% of the total votes. But they are actually underrepresented in these negotiations because there's so many issues attached to them. It's all these associations about corruption, about state capture, about bad service delivery, all those things. And parties are looking now at 2024's national and provincial election and saying, no, we have to position ourselves in the best possible position so that we can use these coalition talks and coalition governments ultimately in order to launch us to a different position in 2024. And the ANC is more of a liability than an asset for us in that respect. And I think that makes these negotiations for the ANC very problematic, except in places where they have a clear lead, like, for example, in Johannesburg, like in Ekurhuleni also, and to some extent also in eThekwini, where they are the leading party and therefore can still dictate to a large extent what is going to happen there.
Professor Seepe, I see that you've managed just to come onto the platform, and perhaps you can also weigh in here when it comes to these stalemates that we're seeing coming out of these coalition talks. Do you think that political parties are going to leave it really down to the wire, as in only on the 22nd will we have some form of agreements begin to be made public on the eve of that deadline?
Yeah, obviously the parties will try to use the space that they have to optimize what they can get on the table. But what is the most important is, as Dirk says, that initially you'll see this political grandstanding, which is what we often see in negotiations with unions. But later there's a sobriety that ultimately there must be governance. And I think what parties have done, they've already dealt with the first part, the political grandstanding. What they will then move towards is ready to start saying, if this cannot be met, where do we put the voter here? And I think the pressure from the voters and the message that emerges from the voters is that parties must work together. And what you're going to see would be from the political grandstanding towards what are the minimum that we can agree on. And this is where you find parties beginning to say, beyond the bigger national issues, they start saying, like Mashaba said, that what he's looking for is parties that will agree on the minimum, and the minimum will be social justice. It will be around the pro-poor policies. It will be about making sure that the issues of corruption are dealt with. But here you will find that parties, once they start talking about the voter at the center, because none of them is opposed to the notion of running a functional municipality. None of them is opposed to the idea of water being provided, the services like electricity, creating an environment that would encourage business to flourish. All of them agree on that, and these are the issues that the people, the voter is interested in. But then there will be these issues of who controls the budget and the positions. And you've seen the EFF beginning to position itself in a particular way, and Mashaba positions himself in a particular way, saying, if we're going to work, these are the minimum. And even where Mashaba had taken a position, the EFF had suggested that, look, we can give you the mayorship of Johannesburg, only if you can agree to the ANC somehow. So you can begin to see what they call two-nethering of parties beyond the initial political grandstanding. But ultimately, what they should be focusing on is what do the voters say and what do the people want. And I think here, as Dirk says, the ANC comes a bit humbled, but it is still a majority party. It can easily go, I mean, to tell the truth, the ANC can easily go with the EFF. Besides, the EFF is an offshoot of the ANC. But there are some within the ANC who are concerned that if you bring the EFF, you'll bring a left-wing politics within the ANC. You'll bring a left-wing influence. And there are some who are comfortable with the DA, and they are also saying that we can work with the DA. So you'll find that the ANC, despite the fact that it comes as a loser, because it controls it has a majority in these big municipalities, metros, it might still find common cause with a few parties. But at the moment, the challenge that it faces is whether it will go with the EFF. If it goes with the EFF is going to make demands, and it's going to force the ANC to start adopting all those resolutions of the ANC that the ANC has abandoned. If it goes with the DA, there's still a challenge. And as Dirk says, these parties are not only looking at agreements now, they're also looking at 2024 to say, how will we come out to the voters? Because at least they can see that the voters are a discerning group. They're not a voting cattle like they used to be in the past, or as they were seen to be a voting cattle in the past.
Dr. Kotze, let's talk about the risks then. Should some of these hung councils fail to form governments within the next couple of days, what happens? And what are the risks that are associated with having elections rerun?
Well, there are a bit of a difference of opinion. I've listened to John Steenhuisen. He presents an interpretation of this Municipal Structures Act, which allow, for example, for minority governments and minority coalition governments, like what the DA-led government in Tshwane, for example, was. I personally don't think this is the way forward. This is going to create a very unstable situation for the future for any coalition which hasn't got a majority of 50% plus one. If they reach the point where it becomes dysfunctional, where there's a stalemate, where there's no progress that can be made, they cannot constitute the councils. There's the risk that whoever is in charge can immediately be replaced by or removed by a motion of no confidence by the opposition or combined opposition. Then what is left is two options in terms of the Municipal Structures Act, Section 25. And that is either that it can be taken to court and the court can set aside the election, that is the past election for that particular council, and then a by-election must take place. Or otherwise, the council itself can be dissolved, and that can be done by the MEC, the member of the Executive Council, the Provincial Executive Council, and then an administrator is appointed, and then within 90 days after that decision, there must be a by-election for the council as a whole. It has happened in two places. The one is in Kotze, which is a small town in KwaZulu-Natal, in the middle of 2017, after the 2016 election. And the other one was Metsimaholo in the northern Free State, around Sasolburg. And that both cases were where those councils came to a standstill, where there was a deadlock, and they couldn't move any more forward. Tshwane itself was going in that direction if it wasn't for the epidemic that came in March last year. So it's not therefore a theoretical or an hypothetical idea. It is something where there are already examples of what has happened. The threat for political parties, or the risk, is that what they have now they can lose, because it's a completely new election. So if they develop the reputation that they were the cause of the stalemate in that area, in that city or in that town, and then the voters can punish them and say, we are not going to vote for you again. We are going to vote for other parties. So that's the risk for political parties if they don't reach the point of agreement on a coalition. So it's two very difficult choices that they have. Either stick to their principles and don't come together with other parties, or go into a by-election and risk the possibility of losing some support.
Either way, it looks like it's going to continue to be an anxious wait for the residents in these municipalities. Let me thank you both for your time tonight. Political analyst Professor Sipho Seepe and Dr. Dirk Kotze.